Greece and Turkey have never come to grips with the other's territorial and maritime possessions. Fighter planes frequently violate the airspaces above the Aegean, and as recently as August, Greek and Turkish warships collided with each other during a standoff. Now, things are heating up ever more. Policymakers in Athens are pushing to expand their territorial sea from 11 kilometers to 22. It's a move that is not taken lightly. Ankara has vowed to strike back. It is legally compelled by law to do so and prevent the Aegean from turning into a Greek lake. I'm your host Shirvan and welcome to Caspian Report. Today's episode is sponsored by Trends, which is a community for entrepreneurs, investors, and ambitious people to gather and collaborate. I've been using Trends to network with others, including with people from outside my field of study, and I particularly enjoy the weekly discourses. Trends is all about jump-starting ideas. It has thousands of insiders, investors, startup CEOs, exactly what you need to grow your business. And it's the ultimate knowledge hub from the hustle. With a subscription to Trends, you'll gain access to that community of industry leaders. Right now, you can get your first 2 weeks for just $1. Go to trends.co/Caspian to get started. Bilateral issues between Greece and Turkey have always been on edge. But not all disputes are alike. While disagreements in the eastern Mediterranean stem from economic opportunities, the dispute in the Aegean is all about security. Much of the controversy flared up after Athens engineered a coup in Cyprus in 1974 with the intent to annex the island. Turkey, seeking to protect its ethnic kin on the island, invaded Cyprus, which resulted in its occupation of the north of the island. When hostilities ceased, Athens and Ankara started delineation talks to secure their military positions. In addition to territories, the talks included airspace and maritime zones. However, unbeknownst at the time, the negotiations produced even more disputes, and much of it revolved around the Aegean. As an extension of the Mediterranean, bounded by the Greek and Anatolian peninsulas, the geography of the Aegean is complicated. With more than 2,400 islands, mostly Greek, and with high seas in between, the space is a vital economic and security lifeline to both Greece and Turkey. Not surprisingly, the two nations have taken on seemingly incompatible positions on the exercise of sovereignty over the Aegean Sea. At the heart of the dispute is the evolution of the law of the sea. The territorial division resulting from the Treaty of Lausanne in 1923 and the Treaty of Paris of 1947 seemed natural. Athens gained ownership over nearly all of the islands in the Aegean. However, with the evolution of international law following World War II, the status quo changed dramatically. The United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, established in 1982, granted both Greece and Turkey the rights to claim up to 22 kilometers off their coasts as their territorial seas. Prior to the law of the sea, the two countries enforced territorial seas up to 11 kilometers, which already was the double of what had been practiced in the early 20th century. So with the introduction of new rules, the maritime stalemate between Greece and Turkey was disrupted. Suddenly, international mechanisms favored the Greeks, which left the Turks at a disadvantage. From 1936 onwards, the extent of territorial waters went from 5.6 kilometers to 11 kilometers and eventually to 22 kilometers. With so many Greek islands scattered all over the Aegean, many within reach of major Turkish urban centers, Greece benefited from this legal evolution at an exponential scale. Still, Athens refrained from exercising its legal right for fear of provoking hostilities with its neighbor. Further cementing the stalemate in 1995, the Turkish parliament passed a resolution that would grant the country a cause for war if Greece were to enlarge its territorial waters to 22 kilometers unilaterally. The reason for this belligerence is because national interests are at stake. Should Greece extend its territorial sea in the Aegean, its share of control would jump from 43.5% to 71.5%. while Turkey's share would increase only slightly from 7.5% to 8.7%. The big change would occur in international waters, which would drop from 49% to 19.8%. Much of it would go to Athens. This then explains Turkey's refusal to recognize the law of the sea and its uninterrupted pressure on its neighbor. Turkey cannot allow the Aegean to become a Greek lake, and the reason for this is tied directly to national security. The Sea of Marmara, enclosed by the Bosporus and the Dardanelles, forms the political, economic, and cultural heartland of Turkey. The well-being and security of this space is intrinsically tied to the nearby waters, the Black Sea and the Aegean Sea. A sudden doubling of hostile territorial water so close to the Turkish heartland is an unmistakable threat to Turkey. It would immobilize the Turkish navy and restrict its freedom of navigation to its immediate shores. As defined by the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, anything within the belt of territorial sea is regarded as sovereign territory of the state. This sovereignty also extends to the airspace above and the seabed below. Technically, foreign ships, both civilian and military, can still pass through it under the conditions of innocent passage. The trouble is that in practice the right of innocent passage has tangible restrictions for military vessels. For instance, warships cannot make sudden maneuvers or even hold security drills. Submarines must navigate on the surface, and inspections are possible. If Greece were to expand its territorial waters to the full extent of the law, the Turkish navy would be crippled. Warships going from and to Istanbul would be subject to limitations set by the right of innocent passage or even military procedures embraced by Greece. Major Turkish urban centers like Izmir, a city that is 7 times the size of Athens, would be nearly cut off. Meanwhile, the islands in the Cyclades region and the Dodecanese would be connected, and Turkey would be obliged to pass through Greek waters to reach Istanbul. At whole, Turkey's heartland would be disconnected from the Mediterranean. Now, considering the existing hostility between Turkey and Greece, the latter is more than likely to use the legal code to suppress the mobility of the former. Either way, that is a security risk no country would accept, regardless of who is right. To ensure its security, the Turkish navy must retain the freedom of navigation in the Black Sea and the Aegean. The situation is somewhat reminiscent of the Cuban Missile Crisis, when the Soviet presence on the island posed a direct threat to the American homeland. The United States reacted by violating international law and imposed a naval blockade, which then prevented the Soviets from strengthening their base on the island. Thus, even though international law works in most cases, sometimes the rules fail miserably. That's why Greek and Turkish fighter planes frequently taunt each other over the Aegean skies and violate the airspace above, as a testimony of rejecting the other's sovereignty over the disputed areas. Of course, the story of security is also true for the Greeks. Its heartland surrounds the capital of Athens, and its well-being is tied to the sea. And so the Greeks very much seek to increase their security buffer, especially as long-range missile technology continues to improve in speed and accuracy. That's why last month the Greek government announced plans to expand Greek territorial waters in the Ionian Sea along its western coastline from 11 kilometers to 22. In the first stage, the Greeks will extend their sovereignty towards the west from the Diampontia Islands to Antikythera. So from Corfu to Crete, Greece will double its territorial sea. Eventually the plan is to do the same in the Aegean, but it cannot be done unilaterally. It's quite ironic that the mechanisms of international law, and specifically the law of the sea, was designed to grant nations diplomatic means to resolve disputes. And yet in the Aegean it has done the exact opposite. The way the legal codes evolved have only facilitated more conflict. This, of course, was never the intent, but Athens and Ankara are stuck at an impasse nonetheless. The principle of equidistance, a concept where maritime boundaries are bound to median lines, is a time-tested solution that is worth exploring. political rhetoric and military posturing do little but open old wounds. In turn, such political sentiment presses lawmakers to raise defense spending, which then increases the odds of miscalculation. It's a zero-sum game. Turkey and Greece would be better off resolving things on a diplomatic level. And there are many ways to go about this, but none that would fully satisfy the needs of either side. Technically, international law does not impose a restriction on the 22-kilometer territorial water, but jurisprudence fills the gaps in the law of the sea on delimitation of maritime spaces. There are plenty of nations that have voluntarily limited their territorial seas to avoid geopolitical conflict. For instance, Japan limits its territorial sea to just 5.6 kilometers to avoid territorializing the Soya Strait, the Tsugaru Strait, the eastern and western channels of the Korea Strait, and the Osumi Straits. The United Kingdom limits its territorial waters at 5.6 kilometers in some of its overseas territories, while Estonia and Finland limit their sovereignty in the Gulf of Finland. So there are plenty of special cases around the world, and they are most practical in congested places. Since there are so many islands in the Aegean, a bilateral agreement between Turkey and Greece could see the islands around Athens with 22-kilometer territorial water, while the smaller Greek islands by the Turkish coast, precisely the possessions in the North Aegean and the Dodecanese, would continue to adhere to the 6-kilometer territorial water. Some international corridors could also be established, for instance in between Lesbos and Chios, between Antipsara and Kalogeri, and between Rhodes and Karpathos. These corridors need to be in places of high sea, but they do not need to be wider than 8 kilometers. An example of this is the Gulf of Finland, where Estonia and Finland have voluntarily reduced their territorial waters and created an international corridor as to allow the Russian Navy access to St. Petersburg within international waters. The boundaries in the Gulf of Finland illustrate that sometimes concessions can actually strengthen national security. Similar concessions in the Aegean would give both the Turks and the Greeks some breathing room. Civilian merchant ships could operate with greater ease, while Istanbul and Athens would remain secure from each other. Izmir would be connected to Istanbul, and the Turkish Navy could freely go from the Sea of Marmara to the Mediterranean without passing foreign waters. At the same time, Greece would extend its sovereignty in the Saronics, Sporades, Ionian, and the Cyclades regions. Altogether, this workaround would restrict sovereignty in areas sensitive to navigation, while enforcing it in areas that are necessary for security. Which islands would subscribe to what level of sovereignty is a matter of debate. Whatever is decided, the ultimate resolution will have to maintain reasonably high seas corridors from the Black Sea to the Turkish Straits to the Mediterranean. The point is that a bilateral deal would secure both the Greek and Turkish heartlands without giving one side the decisive upper hand. The dispute between Turkey and Greece will not rest easily. The pessimist will complain about high winds, the optimist expects it to change, but the realist adjusts the sails. I've been your host Shirvan from Caspian Report. If you found this video useful, please leave a like, comment and subscribe. Thank you for watching, and Sol.